Naomi Calloway was 29 years old, a quiet woman who had spent the last 4 years working as the live-in housekeeper for one of the largest estates in the Brennan family's name. She wore the same gray uniform every weekday and a navy cardigan over it on the cool mornings, and she kept her hair pulled back in the same low bun she had worn since the day she was hired. She moved through the house the way she moved through most things, carefully, without taking up more space than she needed. On a cold morning in early November, she was standing in the kitchen of the main house when the lady of the house came down the back stairs with 2 suitcases already packed and set them at Naomi's feet. The suitcases were Naomi's. The lady of the house told her to be off the property in 20 minutes. She told her there were no second chances for women like her. She told her that whatever Naomi thought she was going to do with the child she was carrying, she was going to do it somewhere else. She had no idea who the father was. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The rain that morning was the slow, soaking kind that did not announce itself until it had been falling for several minutes. Naomi stood on the curved gravel drive with her 2 suitcases at her feet and a thin coat that was not enough for the weather. She did not knock again at the door behind her. She did not look back at the house. She picked up the suitcases, which were heavier than she remembered packing them, and she began to walk down the long drive toward the road. She had not been given time to call anyone. She had not been told where her last paycheck would be sent. She had been told only what she had been told. In the same flat, careful voice the lady of the house used for everything, and she had not argued, because she had learned, working in that house for 4 years, that arguing with Margaret Brennan was a thing women did once. Naomi was 4 months pregnant. She did not yet know that the man whose child she was carrying had quietly arranged, almost 3 years ago, for exactly this morning to be one she would never have to walk through alone. Naomi had come to the Brennan estate at 25, hired through an agency, recommended by a woman who had worked for the family's previous generation and who had told the agency, in writing, that Naomi was the most reliable young woman she had ever trained. She had started in the laundry. She had moved up to the main floor within 6 months. By her 2nd year, she had been given the keys to the East Wing, where the senior member of the household kept his private library and his study, and a small sunroom in which he took his coffee every morning at exactly 6:45. The senior member of the household was named Edward Brennan. He was the father of the man who had married Margaret. He was a widower, a retired industrialist, a quiet man in his early 70s who had spent the last decade of his life living in the east wing of his son's house because the son's wife had insisted that it was best for the family to be together. He had not particularly wanted to live there. He had agreed because that was the kind of man he was. He had liked Naomi from her first week. He had asked her, on a Tuesday morning over coffee in the sunroom, whether she would consider being the one who brought him his morning paper. She had said yes. She had brought him the morning paper for 2.5 years. He had died in February. That was who the father was. Edward Brennan and Naomi Calloway had been close in a way the rest of the household had never seen and would not, even now, have known how to describe. It had not been a romance in the loud sense of the word. It had been 2 people who had recognized each other in the quiet of a large house, who had spent 2.5 years having coffee together in a sunroom at 6:45 every morning, who had eventually, on a Sunday in August of his last summer, decided that what was between them was something the world did not need to be told about until they were ready to tell it. They had not been ready when he died. The pregnancy had not been planned. It had been discovered in early September, 3 weeks after his funeral, by a young woman who had spent that whole August trying to understand how to be alive in a house in which the only person who had ever truly seen her was no longer in the sunroom at 6:45. She had not told anyone. There had been no one to tell. She had continued working because she had needed the job. She had let out her uniform at the waist twice. She had been careful. She had not been careful enough. On a Monday in early November, Margaret Brennan had walked past her in the upstairs hallway and had looked at her for a moment too long. On Tuesday, Margaret had begun asking the other staff what they knew. By Friday morning, the suitcases had been packed and brought down the back stairs and set at Naomi's feet in the kitchen. That was what Margaret had decided to do. What she had not done, because she had not thought to do it, was ask Naomi a single question about who the father was. Margaret had assumed. Margaret had assumed because that was what Margaret did. She had assumed it was one of the gardeners. She had assumed it was a man from the village. She had assumed it was, in any case, a problem belonging entirely to the young woman in front of her, and not to the house, and not to the family name. She had been wrong about every part of that assumption. The error was structural. The error was about to become very expensive. Naomi walked to the bus stop at the bottom of the long road. The bus did not come for 40 minutes. She sat on the small metal bench under the small metal shelter, and she watched the rain fall on the suitcases at her feet, and she did not cry. Not because she did not want to, but because she had learned a long time ago that crying in public places was a luxury she could not afford. When the bus came, she paid the fare with coins from the bottom of her purse, and she rode it 3 stops. And she got off at the edge of a small commercial district she half knew, and she stood for a moment on the wet sidewalk, trying to decide where to go. She walked 4 blocks to a building she had been to exactly once before, on a Saturday morning in October of the previous year. The building was a small, plain 2-story office with a sign on the door that read Whitlock and Haynes, Attorneys at Law. The sign was old. The paint on the door was newer. Inside, behind a quiet front desk, sat a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat low knot and reading glasses on a thin gold chain around her neck. Her name was Dorothy Haynes. She had been Edward Brennan's personal attorney for 31 years. She looked up when Naomi came through the door. She looked at the suitcases. She looked at Naomi's face. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she got up from behind the desk, and she came around it, and she took Naomi's coat off her shoulders without asking, and she hung it on the hook by the door. "He told me," Dorothy said. "Before he told me you might come. I have been waiting since February. Come in, sit down. Eat something first. Then we will talk." 3 years before that morning, on a Thursday in early October, Edward Brennan had walked into Dorothy Haynes's office unannounced and had sat down in the chair across from her desk and had said he wanted to make some changes to his will. He had been 70 years old. He had been in good health. Dorothy had asked him what the urgency was. He had said there was no urgency. He had said he wanted to do it now while there was no urgency, because he had learned in 70 years that the things you did under urgency were the things you got wrong. He had spent the next 4 hours with her going through every provision. He had not told her that day why he was making the changes he was making. He had told her on a Tuesday 2 years later, after he had spent 18 months having coffee at 6:45 with a young woman named Naomi Calloway. He had told her then because he had wanted her to understand that the changes had not been impulsive. They had been a long, careful preparation for a possibility he did not yet know would happen, but had wanted to be ready for in case it did. What Edward had done 3 years before he died was this. He had moved the controlling interest in the Brennan Family Trust, which was the entity that held the estate, the businesses, the investment portfolio, and the house itself, out of the joint structure in which it had sat for 40 years, and into a new structure he had built quietly with Dorothy. Under the new structure, the day-to-day management of the trust continued to sit with his son, William Brennan, who was Margaret's husband. The controlling vote, however, had been moved to a board of 3 trustees. The 3 trustees were Dorothy Haynes, a retired federal judge named Theodore Acker, who had been Edward's closest friend for 45 years, and a single seat reserved for the legal guardian of any biological child of Edward Brennan, born after the date of the document, until that child reached the age of 25, at which point the seat would transfer to the child. Edward had not had any biological children after the date of the document. He had also not had any before it, other than William. The provision had sat in the trust documents for 2.5 years doing nothing. Dorothy had checked it every January, the way she checked everything, and had filed it back into the drawer. On a Tuesday in late September of the year he died, Edward had called her from the sunroom phone at 6 in the morning. He had told her there was something she should know. He had told her about Naomi. He had told her about the coffee. He had told her about the Sunday in August. He had told her that he did not know what was going to happen, but that if anything ever did, the provision was no longer hypothetical. He had told her where Naomi lived. He had told her where to find the agency that had hired her. He had asked her to keep watch. Edward had died 4 weeks later, in his sleep, in the bedroom of the East Wing. The funeral had been large. Margaret had managed it. Naomi had served coffee in the front room afterward and had not been allowed to sit down. Dorothy had been there. Dorothy had watched Naomi the entire afternoon. Dorothy had said nothing. She had gone back to her office on Monday morning and had opened the drawer and had checked the provision again, and she had begun, quietly, to prepare. Naomi sat across from Dorothy now, in the same small office, with a cup of tea Dorothy had made for her on a hot plate behind the desk. Dorothy had not asked her anything yet. Dorothy was letting her drink the tea. After a long time, Dorothy reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin black folder. She set it on the desk between them. She opened it. "I need to ask you a question first," Dorothy said. Her voice was quiet, even, not unkind. "And I need you to answer it honestly. Was Edward the father?" Naomi looked at her for a long moment. She had not said it out loud to another person yet. She had not said it because she had not believed there was anyone who would want to hear it. She said, very quietly, yes. Dorothy nodded once. She closed the folder. She opened a second drawer and took out a different folder, much thicker than the first, and she set it on top. "Then there is a great deal we need to talk about," she said. Naomi spent the rest of the morning in Dorothy's office. Dorothy walked her through the provision in the trust document. She walked her through the prenatal testing that would need to be done to establish paternity, which Edward had quietly arranged before his death by leaving samples with a private lab Dorothy had selected. She walked her through what the controlling vote on the trust would mean for the management of the estate, which was currently being executed by William Brennan and overseen, in practice, by Margaret. She walked her through the timeline. The paternity confirmation would take approximately 6 weeks. The seating of the third trustee, in Naomi's name as legal guardian, would take approximately 90 days from confirmation. The first board meeting at which Naomi would have a voting seat would occur in early spring. Until then, Dorothy would handle everything. Until then, Naomi would not need to think about the Brennan house at all. Naomi did not understand most of what Dorothy was telling her. She understood enough to know that something Edward had built 3 years before he died was now standing between her and the rain on a gravel driveway. She did not cry in Dorothy's office. She cried later, in the small apartment Dorothy had arranged for her above the office, after Dorothy had gone home for the evening and left her with a key and a heater and a small bag of groceries on the counter. She cried for a long time. Then, she went to sleep in a real bed for the first time in 9 months. She did not move fast. Dorothy was clear about this from the first morning. Dorothy had been an attorney for 41 years, and she had learned in her second decade that the only kind of justice that held was the kind that arrived in the correct sequence, with the correct documentation, on the correct desks. Naomi's job, between November and the spring, was to be healthy, to eat, to rest, to attend the prenatal appointments Dorothy scheduled with a private obstetrician in the next town over, to allow Dorothy to do her work. Naomi agreed to all of it because she had no other framework. She had not been asked to allow someone else to do something for her in a very long time. She was not sure, the first few weeks, that she remembered how. In the meantime, at the Brennan house, Margaret Brennan believed the matter was closed. She had not heard from Naomi. She had not heard from the agency. She had instructed the staff not to mention Naomi's name. She had told William, when he asked at dinner 2 weeks later why the housekeeper had been replaced, that the previous girl had been let go for theft. William had not pressed. William rarely pressed. He had been raised by his father to be the kind of man who did not press, and he had been married to Margaret long enough to be the kind of man who could not. He had asked Margaret to handle the household, and she had handled the household. He had not, in the entire conversation about Naomi, thought to ask his late father's attorney any questions at all. Dorothy had not been to the Brennan house since the funeral. Dorothy had been doing her work somewhere else. The paternity confirmation came back on a Wednesday in mid-December. The result was conclusive. Dorothy filed the result with the surrogate's court the same morning, along with a petition to seat the third trustee. The petition would sit in the court's docket for 90 days, while notice was given to the existing trustees and to William Brennan as the day-to-day manager of the trust. Notice would also be given, separately, to Margaret, because the trust documents Edward had drafted 3 years before he died required notice to be served on any spouse of a managing trustee whose vote could be affected. The notice was a single page. It described, in the dry language of a courthouse filing, the existence of a third trustee seat, the establishment of biological paternity, and the date on which the seat would be activated. It did not mention Naomi by name. It listed her only as the legal guardian of the minor child, identity to be confirmed under seal. The notice arrived at the Brennan house on a Friday morning in early February, in a plain envelope from a courier. Margaret opened it in the kitchen because she opened all of the family's mail. She read it once. She read it again. She did not understand half of what she was reading. She walked it up to William's office and put it on his desk. William read it. William put on his reading glasses and read it a second time. William sat very still for a long moment. Then, William said one word. Dorothy. He called Dorothy's office. Dorothy answered on the second ring, because Dorothy always answered on the second ring. He asked her if she could come to the house. Dorothy said she could come to her own office instead, and she could see them at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And she would prefer that the meeting be held there because there were several documents that required reference. William said that would be fine. Margaret, listening from the doorway, said nothing at all. On Monday morning, Margaret arrived at Dorothy's office at 5 minutes before 10, dressed in a way that was meant to communicate the seriousness with which she was taking the morning. William arrived 2 minutes after her. Dorothy had asked Theodore Acker, the retired federal judge, to attend in his capacity as the second trustee. He was already seated in the conference room when the Brennans came in. He nodded to William. He did not nod to Margaret. Naomi was not in the room. Naomi was at her obstetrician's appointment, which Dorothy had scheduled specifically for that hour. Naomi had not been told the meeting was happening. Dorothy had been very clear about that. Naomi did not need to be in the room. The documents were sufficient. Dorothy opened the meeting. She thanked them for coming. She said there were several matters requiring acknowledgement before any further conversation could take place. She placed the first document on the table. It was the trust amendment Edward had signed 3 years before he died. She walked through the provision establishing the third trustee seat. She explained, in the dry voice she had used for 41 years, what the seat meant and how it had been triggered. Margaret read the document while Dorothy talked. Margaret's face did not change, but her hand on the edge of the table did, very slightly. Dorothy placed the second document on the table. It was the paternity report. Dorothy did not read it aloud. She let William read it. William read it slowly. He did not say anything when he was finished. He looked up at Dorothy. He looked at Theodore. He did not look at Margaret. Dorothy placed the third document on the table. It was a single page summarizing the implications. The biological child of Edward Brennan, due to be born in late April, was entitled, under the trust documents, to be represented on the controlling board of the trust through a legal guardian until the child reached the age of 25. The legal guardian, by Edward's specification, would be the child's mother. The mother had been identified. The seat would be activated upon the child's live birth and the filing of the birth certificate, which Dorothy had confirmed would be done in the next county. William read the summary twice. He set it down on the table. He said, very quietly, "Why didn't he tell me?" He intended to, Dorothy said. He ran out of time. William nodded slowly. He did not look angry. He looked, mostly, like a man who had just understood several things about his father that he had not understood while his father was alive. He looked at Margaret for the first time since he had come into the room. "Where is she?" William said. Margaret did not answer. Margaret was looking at the paternity report. "Margaret," William said. "Where is Naomi?" Margaret said, "I don't know." "Don't lie to me," William said. He did not raise his voice. He had never raised his voice in his life. He had not needed to. "Where is she?" Margaret looked up. Margaret looked at Dorothy. Margaret said, "I asked her to leave." "When? In November?" "Why?" Margaret did not answer. Dorothy spoke for her. Dorothy's voice was even, not cold, simply precise. "Mrs. Brennan placed 2 suitcases at Miss Calloway's feet at approximately 7:30 in the morning on the 8th of November and required her to leave the property within 20 minutes. The morning was cold. It was raining. Miss Calloway was 4 months pregnant. She walked to the bus stop at the bottom of the road and waited 40 minutes for a bus. She arrived at this office at approximately 11 o'clock the same morning. She has been in my care since. The room was quiet for a long time. Theodore Acker, who had not spoken once, took off his reading glasses and folded them and set them on the table in front of him. He looked at William. He looked at Margaret. He looked back at William. "William," Theodore said. His voice was very soft. "I have been your father's friend for 45 years. I am going to say this once. Your father wanted this child to come into a house that recognized her. Whether that house is yours, or whether it is somewhere else, is not, at this point, a question for Dorothy or for me. It is a question for you." William looked at Margaret. He looked at her for a long time. He did not speak. Dorothy let the silence sit. Then she said, quietly, "There is no requirement on anyone in this room today. The trust will operate the way Edward designed it to operate. The seat will be activated at birth. Mr. Brennan will continue in his role as managing trustee. The board will meet as constituted. Whatever else happens between any of you is a matter for you. We are simply informing you of what already is. William stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up the 3 documents and folded them carefully and put them inside his coat pocket. He walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He turned halfway back. He spoke quietly, only for Margaret, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You threw a pregnant woman out of my father's house," he said. "You did it without asking me, without asking her, without asking who the child was. You decided what kind of person she was on a Monday in a hallway, and you made yourself the judge of it by Friday morning. That was the part that cost you. Not the child. Not the house. The deciding." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The divorce was filed in March. Margaret retained the city apartment, which had been in her name. She did not retain the estate, which had been in William's. She did not retain her seat at the family's foundation, which was controlled by the trust she had not, until February, understood was no longer hers to assume. The board of the foundation accepted her resignation by mail. They did not write back. Naomi gave birth in late April at a hospital 20 miles from the Brennan estate, with Dorothy in the waiting room and Theodore Acker arriving in the second hour with a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. The child was a girl. Naomi named her Eleanor, which had been Edward's mother's name. William came to the hospital the next day. He had not been sure he would be welcome. He had been welcome. He held the baby for a long time without saying anything. Naomi watched him. Naomi understood, in the quiet of the hospital room, that William had loved his father in the way Edward had loved his coffee at 6:45, quietly, without ever quite saying so. She decided, sitting in the bed, that the girl would know her uncle. She told William so. William cried. By the following autumn, Naomi had moved into the east wing of the estate, at William's invitation, in a small set of rooms that had been Edward's. She did not work in the house anymore. She sat on the board of the trust as legal guardian of her daughter. She kept the same low bun. She kept the navy cardigan. She brought her own coffee down to the sunroom at 6:45 in the morning, because that was the hour she had learned, and the hour she had kept, and the hour she did not intend to give up. On a cold morning in November, exactly 1 year after the morning she had stood on the gravel drive with 2 suitcases at her feet, Naomi sat in the sunroom of the east wing with her daughter asleep in a small basket on the floor beside her chair. The light through the windows was pale and clean. The coffee in her cup was hot. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, the slow, soaking kind that did not announce itself. She watched it for a long time. Then she leaned down and adjusted the blanket on her daughter's basket, and she picked up the morning paper that had been left for her on the side table, and she began to read. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.